Well, the Subcommittee of Water Resource and Environment, Full Transportation and Infrastructure Committee will come to order. I want to thank for everybody attending today. I know there'll be members in and out. There's a lot going on today. I think everybody's trying to finish up a lot of loose ends and cross the T's and dot the I's here before we go back and meet with our constituents in August. A couple housekeeping business first. I ask unanimous consent that the hearing record be kept open for 30 days after this hearing in order to accept written testimony for the hearing record. Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered. Also, I ask unanimous consent that written testimony submitted on behalf of the following parties be included in this hearing's record. Scott Thompson, the Executive Director of the Oklahoma Department of Environmental Quality, Clarence Anthony, the CEO and Executive Director of the National League of Cities, and Jonathan Phillips, the Managing Director of ANCA Funds, Congresswoman Janice Hahn from California. Is there objection? Hearing none. Without objection, so ordered. Okay. I'll open up my opening remarks. Today we're here to talk about helping revitalize Americans' communities through the Brownfields program. Following the passage of the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Comprehensive and Liability Act of 1980, also known as Superfund, a new kind of property emerged, brownfields. Brownfields are properties where contamination was suspected but unknown. These sites include inactive factories, gas stations, salvage yards, and many other previously used properties where possible environmental liability and cleanup standards prevented their continued use and redevelopment. Fear of environmental liability at these sites caused developers to look outside cities to previously undeveloped properties for new opportunities. This left many sites untouched, driving down property values, contributing to blight, and providing no tax revenue to cities. Both the states and the EPA began looking for ways to more successfully address the concerns with potential contamination to get these sites back to productive use. In 1995, the EPA issued a demonstration grants to help assess sites to determine what cleanup might be needed. States, cities, and developers also began looking for better ways to address these sites. In 2001, Congress created this specific authority for dealing with brownfields, the Brownfields Revitalization and Environmental Restoration Act of 2001, amended the Superfund law and authorized funding to the EPA to provide grants for assessment and cleanup, provided targeted liability relief for property owners, and increased federal support for the state and tribal programs that were already underway. The authorization for brownfields grants under the Brownfields Revitalization and Environmental Restoration Act of 2001 expired at the end of fiscal year 2006, though Congress has continued to appropriate funds for the Brownfields program. To say this program has been a success is understating its achievements. As of June last year, the EPA and the state and tribal programs have assessed more than 21,000 properties, completed over 99,450 cleanups, and made more than 900,000 acres ready for reuse. On average, $17.79 was leveraged for every EPA dollar spent in the Brownfields program, and nearly 106,000 jobs have been leveraged since the start of the program. Benefits of having these sites redeveloped include increased property values of between 5% and nearly 13%, and measurable environmental benefits such as fewer vehicle miles traveled and decreased stormwater runoff. To quote a line from our upcoming witness from the Ohio EPA, Cindy Hafner, Ohio has been blessed with a rich industrial history which has resulted in a large number of brownfields that no one wanted to use. I know Ohio is not alone in its appreciation for this important program. The Brownfields program has been a successful partnership between the EPA, I want to stress that, partnership between the EPA, states, communities, investors, and developers, because it applies to so many sites and generates such a high return on investment. It is an incredibly popular program throughout the country, but like many other good programs, there may be ways to make it more effective, and I think this is a good time to look at this since the authorization expired in 2007. It's a good time to see what's happening, see what adjustments might be needed, and how we can make the programs better and be more successful. Today we'll hear from the Honorable Martha Stanisalis, the Assistant Administrator for the Office of Solid Waste and Emergency Response at the U.S. EPA. Our second panel, we also have Ms. Cindy Hafner, the Chief Legal Counsel for the Ohio EPA, the Honorable Christian Bullwage, Mayor of Elizabeth, New Jersey, Ms. Kelly Race, Mr. Paul Gruber, and Ms. Vernice Miller Travis. I want to thank the witnesses for taking the time out to be here today and their schedules. And I now recognize Ranking Member Ms. Napolitano for any remarks you may have.
Thank you so very much, Chairman Gibbs, for holding today's hearing on the status of the EPA's program. Welcome to our witnesses again. And the EPA's Brownfields was conceived and initiated as a pilot program, as has indicated my colleague, during the Clinton administration, and fully fledged program enacted was during the Bush administration. It's proven to be a critically community development tool that transforms some, not all, underutilized and potential contaminated sites into productive and useful environments. The term brownfield refers to abandoned and underutilized properties where, with expansion or redevelopment, it is hampered by either real or perceived environmental contamination. They are not Superfund sites, but are properties that are former gas stations, dry cleaning establishments, warehouses, industrial properties, and other things as such, where the potential stigma of contamination was enough to hamper the redevelopment. As one can imagine, these types of sites are located in almost every community in our country. The Brownfields signed in 2002 represented a needed and unique solution to the challenges facing redevelopment of these sites into reproductive spaces with grants as seed money for assessment or cleanup brownfields, and eases the legitimate liability concern of potential developers. Benefits are twofold. First, the redevelopment of these brownfield sites discourages development of green fields, which would exacerbate the problem of suburban sprawl. Second, creating new uses for these otherwise underutilized sites reinvigorates the tax base and generates job growth with sustainable economic development in the areas surrounding these sites. Brownfields the program has been very successful because it facilitated the redevelopment of approximately 49,000 acres of land and created nearly 106,000, sorry, I'm reading my notes. And EPA estimates that it's created 7.3 jobs for every 100,000 invested, leveraging over $17 of investment for every federal dollar invested. It's a highly effective and productive program, and it is not surprising that the competition for brownfield grants is highly competitive. These results beg the question then, why are we not investing more in redevelopment of brownfield spaces? Further, if this is a success rate of an underfunded program, imagine the potential economic impact and potential for job creation that would come from fully funding this program. EPA estimates that over the past 5 years, as my colleague has pointed out, funding deficiencies have caused 1,767 viable programs to go unfunded. This is a backlog of $693.6 million worth of projects. These sites are not only sitting idle and unproductive, but are missing out on the return of investment that these sites could realize if these proposals had received the funding. And it is estimated the grants would have leveraged approximately 50,600 jobs and over $12 billion in public and private financing. In my world, I call that a missed opportunity. There is an area where the Brownfield program has yet to achieve its goal. It is my impression the program was originally created with two goals in mind. First, spurring economic redevelopment of formerly underutilized and potentially contaminated sites, and secondly, targeted redevelopment of sites located in economically distressed communities in particular, which begs the question, are we then not looking at areas where we have more need? In other words, checking whether or not they really are in need of this economic development. While the program's success speaks for itself on the first mission, I'm interested to hear whether or not our witnesses feel as though gains are being made on the second mission. Put another way, are we doing enough to encourage the redevelopment of brownfield sites located in communities throughout the country where the market forces may not be as strong? Are there ways to make sure the successes of the brownfield program can be amplified for urban neighborhoods away from city center or rural or smaller communities where redevelopment may need just a little more push to get started? And I can tell you, Chairman Gibbs and everybody that might be interested, is that there was an Eddie and a Betty in my background in Santa Fe Springs, which created 3,000 jobs. 3,000 jobs with Eddie and Betty. So does it work? Yes, it works. And I think we need to take a longer look at how we can spur more funding into this program to make it more available where it's most needed. Again, welcome to our witnesses, and thank you, Mr. Chairman Gibbs, for holding this hearing, and I yield back.
Thank you. At this time, I want to recognize the full chairman of the Full Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Chairman Schuster.
Thank you, Chairman Gibbs. I appreciate you holding this hearing. I think most people that have been around here long know that there aren't many times, and I give great compliments to the EPA, but this is one of those programs that's been very beneficial, and I think the EPA has done a good job, but we always can do better. When we're dealing with these brownfield sites, I know there are hundreds of thousands around the country. My home state of Pennsylvania, there are thousands and thousands, and we've seen great examples of how you can take those brownfield sites and turn them into valuable, productive pieces of land. As we know, the property values, tax revenues, so when those are able to be brought back online, things improve in the area in general. So we want to continue to view these things and work with the EPA. They make good economic and environmental sense to move forward with these. And in 2001, when we passed the legislation, Small Business Liability Relief and Brownfields Revitalization Act, that was really the starting point for many of these brownfields to be turned back into, as I said, productive pieces of land. And so, again, appreciate what the EPA has done. I'm not going to be here for the second panel witnesses, but Kelly Rice, who spends a lot of time working brownfield issues in Pennsylvania, we appreciate your being here, but your expertise in helping us to move forward. So I thank you and all of our witnesses for being here today. I appreciate that. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman. This time I want to welcome our first panel, our witness, the Honorable Maddie Sinalsis. I didn't do very well at that, I don't think. The Assistant Administrator of Office of Solid Waste and Emergency Response at the U.S. EPA. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Gibbs, Ranking Member Napolitano, and members of the subcommittee. I am Maddie Stanislaus, Assistant Administrator of the Office of Solid Waste and Emergency Response. Again, thank you for the opportunity to be here today, and really thank you for your recognition of the value and benefit of the program, and welcome this exchange. The brownfield sites are the heart of America's downtowns and economic centers, and reclaiming these vacant, underutilized properties are a core to EPA's community economic revitalization efforts. Our Brownfields program has been a catalyst for redevelopment and revitalization, and really hinges on the success of local partners working together to implement the vision of local communities. It achieves public health protection by cleaning up these properties. It achieves economic development on community revitalization, and it addresses social issues like unemployment. The EPA's Brownfield program provides direct funding to communities, states, tribes, and not-for-profits for brownfield assessment, cleanup, revolving loans, technical assistance, area-wide planning, and environmental job training. The Brownfields program is premised on partnerships between the public and private sector, with the EPA's critical early resources providing certainty to leverage funding from other government agencies and the private sector to achieve economic, environmental, and social outcomes. On average, as recognized earlier, for every dollar EPA invests in a community, it leverages about $18 of public and private investment, and we think there's a model that works. It is also, the Brownfields program is also a key component of the administration's effort to advance manufacturing in the United States through the Investing in Manufacturing Community Partnership. Is also a key aspect of the administration's work on advancing sustainable communities in partnership with HUD and DOT. And as recognized earlier, the Brownfields program grantees for FY 2014 are projected to assess more than 1,300 properties, clean up more than 120 properties, leverage about $1.1 billion in cleanup and redevelopment, and create at least 5,000 jobs in communities across the country. Additionally, EPA's research has shown that redeveloping a brownfield site rather than a greenfield site has significant environmental and public health benefits, including reducing vehicle miles traveled, reducing emissions by 32 to 57%, reducing stormwater runoff estimated by 47 to 62%, It also reduces the infrastructure investment necessary to promote economic revitalization. And over the many years of the Brownfield program, implementation has taught us that it is a real model for successful projects, and it's a real model for maximizing the limited federal dollar to really achieve local outcomes, and that occurs again through public-private partnerships and leveraging the limited federal dollars through state, local, and private investment. The job training program is highly successful. We have a 70% hiring rate. It is really targeted in areas of high unemployment, and it is a multi-skill, multi-certificate program. Over the years, we've heard from stakeholders lots of things about its program, how it could be improved. One of the issues that we've heard is whether we should consider increasing the size of the cleanup grants. So we actually think that it could have the unintended impact of actually reducing the total number of communities that receive grants and actually potentially get in the way of this good model of leveraging EPA dollars with local and private dollars. And we've also heard some focus on particular kinds of end uses, and we actually think that it should be the community to decide the end use that works for them, and for us to administer a nationally competitive process that looks at the key factors of additional resources, with strong local partnerships, and a real plan to really implement that rather than the federal government determining what uses are best, be it waterfront, manufacturing, or housing kind of issues. The Brownfields program also provides, on a non-competitive basis, tremendous resources, state and tribal programs to build and administer a cleanup program. As you all know, the cleanup side of the Brownfield program is largely administered by states and tribes. That's really critical resources to states to administer that program. Now, a critical aspect of what EPA provides is technical assistance. It's really critical, particularly for communities with a limited capacity, and we believe that that has been really successful in the real spread of communities receiving grants. So in the last grant cycle, 56% of communities under 100,000 receive our grants, and 24% of communities under 10,000 receive our grants. With that, I'll close. I know I'm out of time, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Well, I'll lead off here. First of all, I like your comment about the community deciding what the end use is going to be. That's better. I always believe closer to local driven, and they know what's best in their local community. So I'm glad to see that the USCP recognizes that. I'm curious about approximately how many applications each year do you get, and what's the sites, how you make the decisions which sites get it, and has it become more competitive? Is that a competitive process, or?
Yeah, I can get you the numbers, specific numbers over the years, but in terms of how many we actually award, about a third of the applicants that we award every year. And how we make determinations, the national competition based on criteria that we establish. What are the basic elements of the project, how far in advance the project is, what kind of leveraging other resources to make sure, because ultimately we want to make sure that these projects are successful.
And I think to go along with that, if you can give us the information and later on, but about how many brownfield sites since the program's been in use have been cleaned up and put into new use, and of that, how many was the USPA involved in versus the states doing it all? How that works. So.
Sure. Yeah, we can provide resources. Information regarding where EPA is invested in projects, as well as through states and state resources, which states have invested in cleanups.
I'm curious on administrative cost. This program, how does it compare to other programs within the EPA for administrative costs?
The comparison to other programs, I don't have that in front of me, but again, I can get that to you.
Okay. Do you expect it's higher or lower? Or?
I think it's a model program. I think it's a lean program, and I think so. I'll just.
Yesterday, the EPA's Inspector General released findings that some sites which have been cleared by the EPA Regions 4 and 6 for redevelopment may still contain levels of toxic substances above public health standards. Can you please explain how your office plans to handle this report?
Yeah, I need to take a look at the details of that report, but, cleanups, enabling redevelopment of a site, in some cases may require complete cleanup of contaminants. Some places leaving contaminants in place with effective engineering institutional controls. And a lot of that is administered through the state programs. So, we'll look at the details of that program. We completely are in support of, we want to make sure these cleanups are protective while also advancing redevelopment.
Yeah, I didn't see personally I didn't see the report, but I know that the two regions, that they cleared it for redevelopment, and obviously in fact, according to the IG anyways, there's toxic substances still there, so that's something we really need to address to make sure that our processes and our end processes are adequate so we don't have problems down the road, especially for a new owner.
There are many successful projects where contaminants continue to be in the ground, but it's still protected. And if you have the effective engineering mechanisms, effective legal mechanisms, it can still be protected while the contaminants are left in place.
Okay. So. One thing I know that was in the original authorization is 25% set aside for petroleum, i.e., abandoned gas tanks, and when I think through this, over the years, it used to be, if you're in an urban area, it seemed like almost every intersection would be on 3 of the 4 corners would be a gas station. Now that's not the case anymore. So we've gone through a lot of cleanup. Is the 25% set aside? Is that still needed, or is that causing problems for you when you got so many dollars to work with? But if you got to allocate 25% earmark, essentially, I'm assuming we've made a lot of progress. Programs working. That should be a declining set aside percentage. Or what's your thoughts on that?
Actually, we have suggested the elimination of that provision because I think the administration of that provision really requires upfront dividing.
Wait, did you say you suggest eliminating the 25%?
That provision, that 25%
okay.
provision.
Okay.
Because what that does is it, in a sense, requires you to set aside 25%. And what we would prefer is a consistent national competition among all sites. And all sites should compete in the same way, whether it's petroleum or hazardous substances and all the other elements.
I agree. Because one reason we're having this hearing today is to see what we need to do to make this program better. And if there's, I don't know, just briefly here, do you have any other ideas or suggestions where you see where, if we're looking at a reauthorization bill, that we should be
well, a couple of, administrative costs has clearly been raised, particularly by smaller applicants. It continues to be a burden, and the current legal prohibition of administrative costs, I think, has been raised by grantees to us. Extending the not-for-profit eligibility for also assessments. Not-for-profits play a real strong role with local governments, like housing organizations, and so right now they are ineligible. Yeah. So those are the things that immediately come to mind, but we could provide broader technical assistance to you. I'm
out of time, but I do have one question I do want to get to before we move on. The small business, liability protection, liability protection in general, how do you see that? Has that been working well, or is there problems we should be addressing with that?
Well, yeah, I think the law does provide the acquisition, be it voluntary, involuntary, and the kind of due diligence. I know that looking at the testimony from the National League of Cities, there potentially either is a concern about perception or reality in terms of how do we make sure we protect from liability. We've done a lot of things in this space. For example, what we've heard from lessees, particularly a number of projects rely on lease arrangements, not fee simple arrangements. So we issued a guidance to make clear that a lessee would fall in the same shoes as an owner. But I think there's more, we want to engage more with, be it the National League of Cities or other kind of local mayors and communities on this issue.
Thank you.
Okay.
Mr. Anton, any questions you may have?
Thank you, sir. Administrator Stanislaus, on the topic of liability, there are some that would claim that local governments are left unprotected by surplus liability defenses and exemptions due to how they acquire the site. Even properties acquired through tax delinquency may not be exempt if local government took voluntary steps in a tax delinquency process. However, if EPA has taken action to address this over the years, or have you come up with some remedy for this? And if so, what specifically has been taken, what actions has EPA taken to ensure that these protections rather, do not have the chilling effect on some of the groups they warn of?
Yeah, I mean, we've taken the liability protections set forth in the Brownfield law and provided further guidance of that and provide clarity that municipality can acquire either voluntarily or involuntarily as long as they do certain kinds of due diligence actions. We also understand that there may be a need for more to provide that certainty because none of us want properties to be lying idle, even for the perception of liability. So we welcome further engagement with you all as well as communities around the country, what more we can do to, one, better communicate how they can protect themselves from liability, but if there's more that we can do.
But do you communicate that with either the Conference of Mayors or the Governors Association so that they understand that this is something you have been addressing and somehow some of the smaller communities that have no way of being able to further look into the issue may be able to garner information to help themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, in September, if I invite all the members to attend, we're having a Brownfield conference, and one of the things that a number of communities around the country are going to explain how they've managed liability, how they're able to underwrite projects to enable success.
Is this going to be live streamed?
I don't know. I'll check on that.
We need to be able to get all this information. See, everybody thinks that local governments know what's happening here or what the agency's rules may have now encompassed into helping them. But if we don't get that information to them, we are not able then to get enough information from them how we can help develop the brownfields into productive land.
Okay.
I look forward to working with you on that, sir.
Sure.
Then one witness who will be testifying in our second panel indicates we must refocus our efforts in hope of the successful brownfields redevelopment, what it does to broad-based economic opportunity and community revitalization, especially in those in the bottom of our economic stratus, in other words, our poorer areas. So what is EPA doing to ensure that these underserved communities receive their fair share? Not only that, if they're not successful in the first round and they should be able to reapply, do you tell them how to better their ability to be successful in the second round?
Sure. We've put in place a broad technical assistance program for that reason, because we've heard from smaller communities, distressed communities, the issue of really identifying how to best put together an application. So we do direct outreach, but we're preventive.
How direct, sir? How direct? Because again, I'm going back to being able to ensure that they have ability to know where to find that information, whether it's through some of their organizations, the county governments, et cetera. And that's the issue I'm trying to get across, is getting more openness to the process.
Yeah, everything from engaging, be it the National League of Cities or the Conference of Mayors and local community groups, but we also, through our technical assistance providers, conduct workshops around the country. And we also, in some of our contract vehicles, enables direct assistance to actually prepare applications. We can't provide that direct assistance by providing grants to others to help them. So we think that is going a long way of dealing with this issue. Because we hear from a lot of small towns that, from budget constraints, that they may not have staff on board to really follow these opportunities. So we completely agree that we need to really invest in the technical assistance for smaller communities.
Well, again, sir, I'd love to be able to ensure that we are able to put this in the hands of everybody that would want to patch in, if you will, to any of the online discussion. Then the other area was, and I think you just touched on that, that there are areas where DOT helps out in the brownfield programs and some other agencies. Is there a way to be able to get that information to us and to, well, we can disseminate to our areas, but we need to know who the other partners are besides your local government, your county government, and your private parties?
Yeah, sure. I will get that to you, and I'll give you one example where we're working with DOT. We have something called the Area-Wide Planning Program, which really was a tool designed to communities that have broad economic distress to enable to conduct infrastructure studies, market studies, and planning studies. Based on that, DOT has built within its program some preferential points for communities who've done that local planning efforts. That's one of the areas that we're collaborating with DOT.
Great. Well, that would be something I'd love to see, and I hope that we can get a copy to this committee, subcommittee. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
Yield back.
Mr. Rokita.
Thank you. I thank the chair. Good morning, Mr. Stanislaus. Appreciate your presentation. I mostly now represent a suburban and rural district with some cities in it, and this is really my first exposure to brownfields since not only since being on the committee but since being in Congress. And I didn't have much experience when I was Secretary of State with brownfields, so bear with me. But it seems like the myth is that brownfields are an urban kind of situation. Are there situations where brownfields exist in rural areas or suburban areas, and what might that look like for me?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's one of the reasons, I'm trying to remember the statistics, about 56% of communities are less than 100,000 and 24% less than 10,000. So in smaller rural communities, it could be the former ag processing facility. It could be a former petroleum-related facility. In some cases, it could be that former one big manufacturing facility that the community was built around. So it kind of runs the gamut of the kind of prior uses.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Regarding non-owners that might be occupying the land that was a brownfield or is a brownfield, or if there's Superfund liability of some sort, does that liability extend to tenants or other non-owners, or how does that work? And how do we ensure that the non-owners are secured or protected from liability?
So, I mean, if you're asking in a scenario of an existing contaminated site and a lessee wanted to redevelop the site and not have liability,
yeah,
we've actually issued a guidance to make clear that the lessee will be protected for liability as long as they follow the same steps as an owner would in terms of due diligence.
And then the flip side of that question was, how do you protect against, is there any kind of exposure risk to tenants or anything like that, or is that?
From the contaminants itself?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, the program is built on, EPA administers the grant program, but the cleanup side is almost exclusively administered by state cleanup programs, which is very effective.
Okay. Now, if I understand this right, we have brownfield assessments, and your data suggests that the assessments on brownfields find little or no contamination when the assessment's done. Do you agree or disagree with that?
No, I mean, I think it's a universe. A certain segment, as it was noted earlier, brownfields are abandoned or underutilized, either because there's a real contamination or perception of contamination because they could have a former use. So when you go into a site, you may discover that actually you don't have contaminants on the site. You can move forward on redevelopment.
Right.
In other cases, you identify, yes, there's some contamination, and then you develop.
What's the percentage breakdown?
I could get that to you. I may be in my testimony, but I get that to you. No, I don't have that right available.
Okay. Have you seen it in the testimony? Let's assume it's not in your testimony. If it's not, can you get it to me in 2 weeks?
Sure, no problem.
Is that fair enough?
Yeah.
2 weeks?
Yeah.
Okay.
No
So should we be funding the assessment side of things, assuming that a good number of these assessments find no contamination? I mean, I'm looking for certainty and increasing property values, and not, and if we're finding that a lot of these assessments, and I don't know the percentage, but we're going to find no contamination, or maybe we need to change the definition of brownfield. Is the brownfield definition too strict?
Well, I mean, really, I view the assessment as a key component of a financial transaction. What assessments would do, whether you find contamination or you don't, really enables the financial underwriting of a project.
Right.
So having done underwriting before I got here, it's does the site have contamination? Then you can immediately go to underwriting. If it has contamination, how do you wall off and then estimate that cleanup of contamination, and then you can build it into project financing. So it's a real critical component of addressing uncertainty to enable projects to move forward.
And if that's the case, regardless of what percentage of assessments we find no contamination with, should we front load? I'm not saying new funding or new money, but should we take some of your funding and use more of it for assessments?
Well, over the years, working with stakeholders, we think we've struck a balance between a right proportion of assessments and the cleanup grants. It's kind of driven by how many applicants we get, for the assessment. Kind of driven by need, given our fixed resources and how we broke it up between assessment and cleanup.
Great. And I see I'm out of time, Chairman, but I just want to say for the record that you indeed put it in your testimony, and 20% of the properties assessed show little or no contamination. Thank you, Chairman.
Ms. Esty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding today's important hearing. Thank you, Ranking Member Napolitano, and thank you, Administrator Stanislaus, for joining us again today. It's great to see you. This is a really important issue. I represent Central and Northwest Connecticut, which is full of brownfield sites. A few Superfund, but frankly, a lot of brownfield sites. So this is of critical importance to us to both preserve open spaces, which I'm glad you mentioned, as well as ensuring we get these properties back into productive play for our communities. It's an important part of revitalizing. So I want to give you two examples of how important this is. We had Naugatuck Valley Community College received a grant for one of the training programs. They've had tremendous success, have trained a lot of young and not as young people to enter into the workforce and are helping clean up sites. And this is a vitally important part of the program, and I'm glad you flagged that. My city of Meriden just recently won a $200,000 award, again, to do assessment, and it's going to be part of an important downtown revitalization. And I want to also salute you for mentioning the critical importance of this to the administration's and, frankly, the country's commitment to manufacturing. Many of our communities in the Northeast, as well as the Midwest, as well as Ohio, Indiana, are full of former brownfield sites, and it's vitally important if we are going to reinvigorate the manufacturing sector to take seriously our commitment to these communities that help drive the last centuries of economic development. We need to look, I think, at the nonprofit sector. You mentioned that in passing, and I'd like to explore that a little bit more with you. For example, in my largest city of Waterbury, there's a nonprofit called Brass City Harvest. They want to address the nutritional needs of the community, help put people to work, and frankly, help teach STEM education to young people. It's a wonderful program, but as a nonprofit, they are not eligible for some of these programs. Can you talk a little bit about what the agency is looking at in this, how important they think that might be? Thank you.
Yeah, we've heard from numerous not-for-profits, those that would like to get, particularly this is applicable to assessment grants. They're currently ineligible. So everything from housing developers that is the extension of local government to construct affordable housing, to various kinds of manufacturing, not-for-profits locally, that they would like these assessment grants to really, again, extend the arm of local government. So, I mean, I think there's an inadvertent division between cleanup and assessment. So you have not-for-profits eligible for cleanup, but they don't have the ability to get the upfront assessment resource to identify sites, whether they are or not contaminated.
And I can tell you our nonprofits have a great deal of trouble coming up with the funds as it is. So to come up with the funds for an assessment to even determine whether this is feasible is a real barrier. It may not seem like a lot of money, but to them it is. Is this an area where you believe congressional action would facilitate or frankly be necessary in order for the agency to include nonprofits?
Yeah, I mean, again, as we've heard from stakeholders, because the statute prohibits not-for-profits to be eligible, it will require congressional action.
Next, I wanted to follow up on your remarks a little bit. We know there's a Senate proposal out there that cordons off some area of the funding and sets them aside. Could you talk a little bit more about whether you think that is a good route? Are there unintended consequences that could come from an understandable and laudable attempt to ensure that certain areas get more attention?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that it should be up to the community at the right time to determine end uses. And a lot of times, viable end uses really come in the middle of that process. And once you've done assessment, you can quantify the cost of cleanup. You can figure out what is financially viable at that site. So among a suite of uses. So if we divide the pot up front, essentially you're putting the federal government in the position of judging an end use, which we don't believe is the right place for the federal government. So rather we would rather have, let's just look at, is the applicant competent? Have they demonstrated competency? Have they demonstrated partnership, additional leveraging resources for the ultimate shared end result of making a project happen on the ground, whatever those end uses may be that the community selects.
And if I may, it ties into, you mentioned in your written testimony about multi-purpose grants. Could you tell us a little bit more about what you've discovered on that?
Sure. This really emerged from comments that we've received from communities, the opportunity to possibly look at both assessment and cleanup grants together. And we think that we want to continue to pursue that. We have authority, existing authority to do that. We're still looking at what's the best fit of mixing a number of uses in one grant. And we need to, I think what we're trying to do is balance flexibility for the applicant versus if you have money that is laid out for extended periods of time, then it may not be the best use of money. So we're trying to figure out giving flexibility for their multi-purposes, but making sure it's structured in a way that's accountable as well. So.
Thank you, and I see my time's expired. Thank you very much.
Mr. Katko.
Thank you very much. I'm from Syracuse, New York. That's my district, and we've had a tremendous amount of experience with brownfields and Superfund sites. And as a matter of fact, Onondaga Lake, which is adjacent to the city of Syracuse, is perhaps one of the largest Superfund sites in the country. And it's reprehensible what previous industry did to the lake, but now we're enjoying a renaissance of that lake that is truly amazing. So I really believe in environmental revitalization with the help of government when it's appropriate. Along the lake, in addition to what's going on with the lake itself, the property along the eastern shore of the lake has enjoyed some renaissance as well. At one site where there was a very large metal scrapyard with all kinds of contaminants has now become one of the largest malls in the United States, and a very successful mall that employs 4,000 people. So the program does work when properly applied. With that being said, I want to throw a little fact pattern at you so I can properly understand your portion of the brownfield revitalization. There is a company that just up and pulled out of Syracuse, Roth Steel, that operated on the shores of Onondaga Lake for over 80 years, I believe. And they went bankrupt, and they're gone. And they left behind a scrapyard that was probably got a stunningly high amount of PCB contaminants in the soils. Now, this property is on the shore of Onondaga Lake, the shore of a Superfund site. And local authorities are now trying to figure out what the heck to do with this place. One of the problems is the unbelievable contamination. A good citizen and a good member of our community bought the property, not knowing how badly it was contaminated, and promptly had to get rid of it because he realized he couldn't do anything with it. And so another steel manufacturer, steel company, scrapyard, bought it, but I'm not sure that's going to work. And I think there's some contemplation about taking the property by the county. So with that fact pattern, that being adjacent to a brownfield site on the shores of it, there is some concern that there's possible leakage into the lake. And after all the hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent by industry and by the government to clean up that lake and to fix it, we now have this problem. And the company's gone, so I don't know what liability there's going to be to that company. It's bankrupt. But what can we do with your program for this site, assuming that the county takes it over? And maybe look at both sides, whether the county takes it over and whether it doesn't, whether or not somebody else takes it over. What's available to make this site and stop it from leaking into the lake and poisoning what is becoming a great place? And I'll note today, I just looked online, a bunch of local leaders to prove that the lake is good, all went swimming in it today. So we don't want to have them go swimming in PCBs. So what can we do?
So I would break my answer to a short-term addressing the risks that you identified in long-term cleanup and redevelopment. So separate from the Brownfield program, and you have the Superfund program, and so we have resources. If there's imminent risk, we can conduct what's called a removal action to deal with the imminent risk. So there's ongoing migration of PCBs. We should, give me the information and we'll work through our regional office on that.
It's Roth Steel and Hiawatha Boulevard in Syracuse.
Okay. So assuming that we've dealt with the imminent risk issue, then the long-term strategy is to really figure out, well, what is the extent of contamination? How can we quantify the cleanup? And what are the redevelopment uses that's going to drive both cleanup and obviously the redevelopment. So we have site assessment grants that the county or the municipality can access. We also have in certain, there's really designed for individual sites, mostly for communities that have struggled to participate in the grant competition. We have a contract-based assistance for going in and actually conduct assessments on site. So we have all a set of tools that are potentially available.
Okay, now, how quickly, if we believe there's an imminent risk, how quickly can we get that moving?
Well, I mean, I will, connect with my staff, connect with the regional office, and if I can get a point of contact, and we'll, we need to figure out, is there imminent risk, and then the action necessary. But, we could do that in a relatively short time period. I'm not sure exactly that time period, but we can initiate the examination of that relatively soon.
Well, great. I'll make sure my office contacts yours and we get that moving. But I appreciate it. I mean, these are the types of things that communities like Syracuse, New York, that are recovering from the mass exodus of manufacturing over the last 20 years, revitalizing those neighborhoods and revitalizing those areas. And I agree with my colleague, Ms. Esty. We absolutely have to get manufacturing back in New York State and in the Northeast, and I believe we can do that. But in the meantime, we got to take care of the sites that some manufacturers and businesses left a mess. Whether there's liability to those companies down the road, I think, is a separate issue. We got to get these places cleaned up, and we can't ruin what's becoming a gem for Central New York, and that's Onondaga Lake. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right.
Can you maybe pull your mic up a little closer to you? This room is just, acoustics in here is a challenge.
Okay.
Mr. Huffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, and thanks for your testimony, Mr. Stanislaus. I have seen the value of this Brownfields program in my district in the North Coast of California. Among many examples, I have an Indian tribe in a very rural part of the far northern end of my district, the Elk Valley Rancheria. They've used Brownfield program funding to redevelop a couple of abandoned motels that were highly contaminated with asbestos, and they are turning those into really important economic development projects. So thank you for that. An even better example is in another rural part of my district, Humboldt County, where at the height of the timber industry, there was a pulp mill on a spit of land called Samoa, with the pristine Pacific Ocean on one side and the pristine Humboldt Bay on the other side. It was abandoned. The Chinese company that came to own it at one point basically walked away from it, leaving all sorts of toxic chemicals in place in leaking tanks. And we discovered that millions of gallons of highly toxic pulping liquors were leaking right as we went into the government shutdown a couple of years ago. And I really want to thank your agency, because that would seem like the worst possible time for a member of Congress to have a crisis like that, right in the tsunami zone. Could have been one of the worst toxic incidents in the country if something had gone wrong. And EPA leapt into action with other local government partners, and we got that site cleaned up, despite the shutdown that definitely complicated that effort. So you're doing terrific work, and I'm very grateful to your program and your agency. I wanted to ask you about a problem, a very vexing problem in my district and throughout the West, and that is trespass marijuana grows. These are illegal activities that are happening more and more on public lands. I've seen these sites in wilderness areas, and the level of pollution and environmental destruction is quite significant, with rodenticides and highly concentrated fertilizers and just about every terrible practice you can imagine in very sensitive, pristine areas. We can interdict and shut down these sites, but we don't have funding in most cases to actually clean them up. And so I wanted to ask you if you'd given any thought about that, about how folks who are affected by this on public lands throughout the West may be able to work with EPA and the Superfund program. Congress did definitely highlight controlled substances as a source of pollution for this program. But I wanted to hear your thoughts, and also whether there are steps that communities like the ones I represent should be taking to better access those funds.
I've not thought about this marijuana problem. There have been other situations where drug production has resulted in contamination, and in some cases we've used the Superfund program to go in and conduct cleanup. In other cases, we provided resources to communities to conduct site assessment or cleanup. We could follow up. We've also had work with law enforcement of where there's some opportunity in the proceeds from an enforcement action that they may take to bring that back into local communities. But we can talk more about
I would love to work with you more on that. And then my second and probably last question involves the California drought. And you know that we're in the fourth year of a critical drought. We have entire communities in Southern California that have lost wells and lost drinking water supplies because of contamination from perchlorate or in some cases nitrates and other pollutants. The Superfund program has provided some benefits, the Brownfield program as well. But I often hear from stakeholders that cleaning up contaminated aquifers, getting them back into the drinking water supply is sometimes an afterthought. And with this critical drought forcing us to value every possible source of potable water that could be brought online and be part of the solution to get us through it, I wonder if you have any thoughts on how your program might be better leveraged to help stretch our drinking water supplies in places like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's really more the Superfund program, the Brownfield program, and you know, we fundamentally believe that we should protect and restore drinking water sources, and that's and I don't think at all that it is an afterthought. You know, although cleaning up aquifers are very tough and takes a longer period of time, it's just the technical nature of cleaning up groundwater aquifers. But I also think that what we'd like on the Brownfield side, there are opportunities to prevent contamination of groundwater. You know, one of the things we've done is try to link up things like green infrastructure, things like preventative measures to prevent further contamination as part of the footprint of a new project.
All right. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Nolan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Stanislaus, for being here and all the important good work that you do. As some of the other members have indicated, we often see, you know, the benefits of a particular program at a specific level, hopefully within our own districts, and then we try to draw some larger conclusions from that. We've had several projects in Duluth, Minnesota, which is in my district, the Canal Park Brewing site and the Clyde Iron Works, both of which were funded by the Brownfield program, but they ended up stimulating and leveraging state investment, city investment, private for-profit investment, nonprofit investment, creating, you know, businesses and restaurants and retail and recreational facilities, hockey rinks, which are a big deal up in our area. My grandkids happen to play frequently at the Clyde Iron Works hockey arena. And they've really created a lot of good jobs, a lot of good business activities, helped to revitalize important neighborhoods. My point in bringing all that up is that clearly in our case, the Brownfield investments by the federal government have stimulated a tremendous amount of additional investment that has been so important for the development of those communities and the businesses and the jobs that flow from that. My question is twofold. One is, have you attempted to quantify the amount of investment that flows from a brownfield investment, the investment made by the other entities that I just cited? And if so, you know, what is that amount? And then secondly, how many worthy brownfield projects have you had to look at and reject for lack of funding? Those would be my two questions. Thank you.
Sure. Let me just write down your question first. Okay. So of the applicants, over the past 5 years, a little over 1,700 viable projects that we scored highly but were not selected because of limited funding. And again, these are highly qualified projects that if we had funding, we think would result in a lot of the outcomes that you're talking about. I mean, in terms of quantifying the additional investments, our 1 for 18 ratio, for every dollar we invest, $18 gets other invested, is information that we've collected from the applicants based on reporting to us, based on the various kinds of mix of funding. Now, we also have done studies about real estate values adjacent to these properties, and it was cited earlier, we see real estate properties increasing, I think in the range of upper, about 10% or so. We're also conducting a study of local tax revenue from the site and associated sites. So there's a stimulative effect, as you noted. So it's not just a project itself, but the stimulative effect of that anchor project, which then attracts other kinds of investments. So we're trying to quantify, we're in the midst of quantifying that as well.
Okay. Well, thank you. That's important, and it continues to have an even ongoing effect once you clean up a site and you stimulate all that investment around it. Why it remains forever an inducement to other business activities to gravitate toward that site. So I applaud you for the good job you're doing administering that program, and look forward to working with you and my colleagues here to see what we can do to expand the tremendous benefits that flow from this program, both in terms of cleaning up our environment and the messes we made in the past, and then moving us forward with good jobs, good communities, good neighborhoods, and community development activities. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, that concludes all our questions. I do have a request, a simple request, really. I know my ranking member is going to have some more questions in writing to you, and any response, if we give it to back to the full committee, so keep it so everybody knows what's going on, and that's what the request. So appreciate that, and appreciate you coming in today, and your excuse, and we'll bring up panel number 2.
Okay, thank you all.
Yes. While panel number 2 is coming up, I do want to recognize a young gentleman who's going to be leaving the committee, Tracy Z. Hold your hand up. Tracy, we're talking about you. Hold your hand up. He's been here in his tenure. He's worked with the Subcommittee on Water Resources and Environment, been a great asset to the subcommittee and the full committee, and I personally want to wish him well in his new endeavors. I guess, is I allowed to say who it is? Water Resources, the Water Councils, Waterways Council. So he's going to, I'm sure we'll have a lot of interaction in the future and input, but I wish him well in his new endeavors and the new challenges as he grows in his professional career. So, Tracy, thank you very much for all you've done here for us. Thank you. Take a moment here for our panelists to get situated. Okay, we'll get started. I think we're ready. I want to thank you all for being here today and taking time out of your busy schedules to come here and talk about something I know that's near and dear to your heart, and it's important. Our first witness is Ms. Cindy Hafner. She's the Chief Legal Counsel of the Ohio Environmental Protection Agency out of Columbus. And welcome, Ms. Hafner. The floor is yours.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Gibbs, Ranking Member Napolitano.
Can you pull that mic up just a little closer, maybe? It'll move. I think it'll move, won't it?
Okay. Oh.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. And members of the subcommittee, I really appreciate you inviting me here today to talk about the Ohio's successful Brownfields program. I am Cindy Hafner, and I'm Chief Legal Counsel for the Ohio EPA. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about our voluntary cleanup program that was designed to clean up brownfields, tell you a little bit about how we use the Superfund grants for brownfields in Ohio, and about the state funding that we use for brownfields in Ohio. In 1994, the General Assembly and Governor George Voinovich passed a law that created a voluntary cleanup program. It was designed to address the universe of contaminated sites that weren't being addressed by the Superfund program or the state's involuntary cleanup program. We have a rich industrial history in Ohio, and that resulted in thousands and thousands of these brownfield sites that were sitting idle, contaminated, and underused. So this program was designed to help those sites get cleaned up. The voluntary cleanup program authorized anyone to clean up a dirty site and receive a legal release in exchange for it. Three key components of the program are rules describing clear processes and cleanup standards that are protective and based on the planned land use, reliance on certified consultants and laboratories to oversee the cleanup in partnership with Ohio EPA, while Ohio EPA focused its oversight on developing the cleanup standards and auditing cleanups after they were completed, creation of incentives in the form of tax abatements and, at the time, low-interest loans. Today, volunteers have used this program to clean up and request a legal release at 484 properties covering more than 9,251 acres. Those, however, are just the tip of the cleanup of cleanups in Ohio, and there's an iceberg of cleanup effect that's underneath it. The program was designed intentionally so that users did not have to request a legal release if it was not necessary for the redevelopment project. Certified consultants tell us that for every one project that they work on that seeks a legal release, there are 5 times as many that they're working on where no legal release is sought, but the cleanup standards of the program are used for the private property transaction. While the statute's policy maximizes privatization and flexibility, it can sometimes create a misperception that only those 484 cleanup projects are a result of our cleanup program. In actuality, a more accurate number is probably about 2,500 cleanup projects have resulted from the program. As the program matured, stakeholders asked for additional liability relief. In 2001, Ohio EPA finalized a Superfund Memorandum of Agreement with US EPA, providing additional assurance to Ohio's volunteers that EPA was satisfied with our program and that they would not ask for additional cleanup for projects that are cleaned up in our program. Additionally, the state's statute was amended several times to expand eligibility of the program so more different kinds of sites could use the program to limit the liability. In the late 90s, CERCLA was amended to provide federal funding, and Ohio uses this funding in 4 ways. First, we provide services free of charge to local governments. Since 2002, Ohio EPA has assisted 104 communities in 57 counties by completing 81 Phase 1 assessments, 23 certified asbestos inspections, and 86 Phase 2 sampling events. We also provide regional workshops for local economic development officials and to provide them understanding and information about all the financial tools that are available to local governments. We also perform training for our certified environmental consultants where we inform them of changes in the program and seek their input on improvements to the program. Finally, we provide free technical assistance to 60 to 80 communities each year conducting brownfield cleanups. This is a very popular tool, especially for our small and medium-sized communities. We use CERCLA 104K brownfield revitalization for our local governments. This has been available since 2002. There have been 128 awards totaling approximately $55.4 million. And this is very essential to our local communities to revitalize their urban cores. They use it for planning, assessments, and cleanup of brownfields. Our state funding programs for brownfields started in the early 2000s. Since then, the state has provided $417 million to assess or clean up 409 brownfield projects. This has leveraged nearly $4 billion in private investment. Ohio's economic development partner, Jobs Ohio, provides $45 million per year for assessment or cleanup where the projects create or retain jobs. Ohio EPA has also invested nearly $500,000 of our own budget to perform Phase 1 for local communities. This fills a gap because those are projects that aren't eligible for other federal funding. Ohio has benefited greatly from the funding available for both CERCLA and state law. Thank you for the funding that you have given to US EPA to pass along to us. As Ohio's economy continues to grow today, new businesses are still interested in locating in brownfields. Ohio's cleanup program, state funding, and federal funding are keystones to the economic growth and revitalization of Ohio. Thanks again for inviting me here to extol the virtues of our cleanup programs in Ohio, and I'll answer any questions later.
Okay. Thank you. Our next witness is the Honorable Christian Bullwage. He's the mayor of the city of Elizabeth, New Jersey. Welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and members of the committee for holding this most important hearing. I've been the mayor since 1993. I've testified here in Congress both before Senate and congressional committees on brownfields from 1994 to 2001 when President George Bush signed the brownfields legislation in Conshohocken, Pennsylvania. Mr. Chairman, brownfields legislation has made it really possible for the private sector to work with municipal governments and invest in our cities. We all know the history of brownfields legislation, and it's part of my testimony, but I'm not going to go through that. I would just like to highlight one in Elizabeth and then talk about some things where the mayors of this country think we can make this legislation a little bit better. The Jersey Gardens Mall in our city was built on a former 166-acre landfill. This partnership between the county, the state, and the federal level of the government all started with a brownfield assessment grant in the 1990s. The conversion of this former eyesore into a shopping center had numerous positive effects. Up to 5,000 jobs, not only the people who work there, but construction jobs, took a health hazard away from our city, continues to flourish with business up 10%, visits are up 37%. The Jersey Gardens is located adjacent to Newark Airport. It has now been renamed the Mills and recently announced a 411,000 square foot expansion on top of the existing 2 million square feet that's there. We work with Union County College. We have a retail skills center, a workforce investment center, provides job placement, soft skills training. We work with We Are One New Jersey, an initiative spearheaded by the County of Union. It also has a 4.8 megawatt sun power rooftop solar system, which is among the largest rooftop systems in North America. That was broke ground in 2011 and has started producing power in February of 2012. Some ways that the mayors and the U.S. Conference of Mayors think we can improve this program, and because it has such a proven track record, the GAO has mentioned that there are 400 to 600,000 brownfield sites throughout the U.S. And the one member asked a question about the rural areas. The U.S. Conference of Mayors did a study years ago that shows there's at least 10 brownfield sites in every congressional district throughout this entire nation. We would suggest that there's full funding of the brownfields program, that the EPA only funds, as the Commissioner said, about 30% of the applications. We would ask that the previously authorized levels of $250 million is fully funded, but we also ask that this committee address higher funding levels. We recognize budgets are tight. Creation of the multi-purpose grant. The Commissioner also spoke of that. Many cities could use the ability to assess a number of properties and provide cleanup grants and loans depending on which sites are chosen for redevelopment. It hinders the opportunity if a city has to apply for a grant, wait 6 months to see if they'll get funding. The developer, the partner could walk away in that period of time. The Conference of Mayors would like to see the establishment of this type of grant, and especially to municipalities who have a proven track record of fully utilizing their brownfield money. Increase to cleanup grant amounts. Many of the easy brownfield sites have been developed. Especially in our city, we've developed some gas stations that may have been easy to develop. The brownfields economic development that occurred at the mall just south of Newark Airport was something in retrospect that the joint effort financially, but there was a market for it. So now we have the tougher ones. We would like to see an increase in the funding ceiling of the cleanup grants to be $1 million, and in some circumstances to be $2 million. This could give additional resources to conduct cleanup at more contaminated sites and bring those properties back to productive use. Allow some reasonable administrative costs. Should be allowed to use a small portion of the grant to cover reasonable administrative costs. Clarify the eligibility of publicly owned sites acquired before 2002. We believe that as long as the local governments did not cause or contribute to the contamination of the property, but just happened to own the property before the law was enacted, they should allow to apply for EPA funding for that property. It took Congress 9 years to pass the original law, Mr. Chairman. I know. I testified here for 9 years, so I know how long it took. And it's been an extremely productive piece of legislation. And we can work together to remove barriers to the local and state governments by addressing some of the mothball sites to the CERCLA liability that the earlier speaker just highlighted how it worked in her state. In closing, Mr. Chairman, I would like to thank this subcommittee for having me testify. I have submitted written testimony, and I will be available to answer questions. Thank you for your time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for your input, and thank you for multiple times coming before the committee. And this program's making it work. So our next witness is Ms. Kelly Race. She's the Brownfields Program Manager for TRC Companies. Welcome.
Good morning, Congressman Gibbs and honorable members of the Water Resources Environment Subcommittee. Thank you for allowing me to testify about this very important program. As you mentioned, I am a Brownfields Program Manager. I have actually 25 years plus years of experience, and I have a bachelor's and master's in geology and have worked on contaminated sites for most of my entire career. Many of the EPA-funded brownfields programs that we work on are located in the Northeast as well as the Midwest and California. We are passionate about the redevelopment of brownfields and the impact brownfields has had on communities. We've seen firsthand how a single site
Ms. Race, can you pull the mic a little closer? We're having trouble back here. I think you can pull the box, just yank it.
How's that?
Yeah.
Good?
Yeah,
okay.
Thank you.
We've seen firsthand how a single site using a few thousand EPA assessment dollars can be transformed into a community icon, and how a portfolio of sites can actually result in the rebirth of a downtown, infusing millions of leveraged dollars into a community. My testimony today will highlight EPA Brownfields' successes, highlight some challenges, and offer some considerations that we think would help make the program more versatile. We all know EPA Brownfields fundings had led to many successful cleanups and redevelopment and has leveraged millions of dollars in private investment. Obviously, an $8 to $10 million decrease in funding for assessment, cleanup, and revolving loan funds has resulted in fewer grantees being awarded. But actually, I guess I back up and say, what are brownfields to communities? Brownfields are opportunities. They're funding that is often the seed money to different organizations to assess, clean up, and sustainably reuse a property. Many of these eligible entities have limited resources to address and facilitate redevelopment of brownfields, as communities are tasked with doing more with less. A couple of examples that I'd like to actually highlight on some creative successes that we've seen over the hundreds of sites that we have worked on across the country include one from Massachusetts, which is a transit-oriented development. This actually was initiated with a $3,000 Phase 1 site assessment and a Phase 2 site investigation. This project actually facilitated over $100 million in private developer interest in the area. The project created a construction of a pedestrian-friendly parking garage, linking it with a former shoe manufacturing mill, and renovated new housing, creating over 340 housing units, 75 which are set aside for low-income families, individuals. The second example is the reuse of a former textile mill in Sanford, Maine. The former mill once produced armed service uniforms. From a $4,000 EPA Brownfields assessment grant, over $16 million of investment was secured, resulting in 274 construction jobs, 36 affordable housing units, and retail and commercial. The third example is a 100-acre former steel facility in Jefferson County, Ohio. From this, Jefferson County received a $1 million assessment coalition grant. Based on that coalition grant, they were able to leverage an additional $6.5 million in state and private brownfields funding, returning 9 vacant properties to beneficial reuse and creating over 150 new jobs. As someone who assists communities in preparing application, the application process can be challenging, but also rewarding when a community must think outside the box on how they will utilize the funds and turn a story of despair into sustainable reuse and opportunity. There are so many worthy projects and communities out there, but the EPA application process is extremely competitive. Now for some of the challenges. The FY Brownfields guidance for assessment of that, approximately EPA allocated approximately 50% of the total amount of funding available under the announcement was to be used for grants for new applicants. While dedicating 50% of funding to new applicants creates a base of eligible new entities, it also limits the funding available for existing grantees who may have a long-established program, spend a considerable amount of time creating an inventory and conducting Phase 1s and Phase 2s to ready those properties for redevelopment. Existing grantees who may have submitted multiple applications only to lose again may result in a disincentive to compete, leaving a program with a large inventory of potential sites stagnant. With regard to petroleum assessment funding, EPA must expend 25% of the amount of appropriated brownfields grants on sites contaminated with petroleum. The Brownfields law outlines specific criteria by which petroleum sites may be eligible for brownfields grants if EPA funding or the state makes a petroleum eligibility. Because of the eligibility determinations, petroleum brownfields funding is harder for grantees to utilize and is more complicated as it is a case-by-case state agency determination. Therefore, the brownfields petroleum funding may actually be sitting on the sidelines, stranded. In summary, the EPA brownfields program works, but we believe there may be considerations in the brownfields funding that provide versatility and flexibility to the program. I'd like to thank the subcommittee for my being able to provide testimony, and I'm available to answer questions.
Thank you. Next witness is Mr. Paul Gruber on behalf of the National Groundwater Association. Welcome.
Thank you. Chairman Gibbs, Ranking Member Napolitano, and members of the subcommittee, thanks for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Paul Gruber. I'm testifying on behalf of the National Groundwater Association, a trade association and professional society of 11,000 members in every state represented here. My testimony will address the importance of using science-based decision-making for the investigation, remediation, and redevelopment of brownfield sites, as well as highlight the importance of preserving and improving the availability of our nation's groundwater resources. The Brownfields Revitalization Act is an excellent example of the right law for the right reasons. Brownfields programs not only are critical for environmental improvement and protection of public health, but they're vehicles to promote economic development, providing employment opportunity for thousands of Americans in both urban and rural areas. On a typical brownfields project, our members support all stages of the investigation and cleanup process. NGWA professionals evaluate various remediation alternatives, employing a variety of sophisticated tools. These tools, such as groundwater models, can cost-effectively assess the public health impacts of proposed remediation technologies and optimize cleanup selection, ultimately turning the site into a springboard for community revitalization. Often, brownfields redevelopment success stories in urban areas receive the most publicity. I want to be sure to emphasize the need to promote the success of rural brownfields development. Potential brownfield sites in rural areas include a variety of legacy industrial operations that previously led to economic development in the area. Examples include manufactured gas plants, fertilizer plants, tanneries, and small businesses like gas stations and dry cleaners, among others. These rural brownfield sites affect soil, surface, and groundwater quality and availability. As most rural residents rely on individual wells or community water systems for potable water supply, these resource impacts can be more critical than those in urban areas. In rural areas, groundwater quality impacts can be more widespread, and hence cleanup costs can be cost prohibitive while having a broader local community impact. In rural areas, the presence of ample green space often minimizes the perceived need to clean up and restore a brownfield site. Rather than an either-or scenario, brownfields and green spaces should be viewed in tandem. By restoring rural brownfield sites, communities can preserve natural existing systems. The preservation of these systems improves and protects surface and groundwater quality and quantity, maintains important groundwater recharge systems, and improves stormwater management opportunities. As many communities currently experience unprecedented drought conditions, by improving and preserving these natural systems in greenfield areas, local communities are now more resilient and sustainable. The EPA Brownfields program is a well-crafted and effective program. As the subcommittee considers reauthorization of the program, NGWA would like to offer the following observations and recommendations. Congress should consider brownfields grant incentives that not only limit liability, but also encourages cleanup and redevelopment of brownfield sites rather than greenfield sites. Why incur the potential liability with a brownfield site when in rural areas ample green space is available for development unless the right incentives are in place. The committee should consider increasing incentives for rural applicants by directing EPA to prioritize funds for rural communities where local groundwater supplies are impacted. Public-private partnerships are effective vehicles to leverage investments and create economic benefits for all stakeholders where single-entity investment may not be feasible. Encouraging beneficial reuse of brownfield sites and providing liability limits while managing long-term cleanup. Lastly, Congress should urge EPA to continue its research focus on development of new technologies and methods of site remediation that integrates combined remedies, integrating risk assessment of future land uses when establishing cleanup goals. Since its inception in 1995, EPA's Brownfield program has changed the way we approach development and reutilization of contaminated sites. It has provided a vehicle to investigate and clean up abandoned sites without encouraging development in greenfield locations. Brownfield grants and cleanups focused in rural areas can be instrumental in reinvigorating economic activity while increasing the value of ecosystem services of undisturbed natural systems. With over 400,000 brownfield sites across the country, it's likely we probably all live or work near one. The work needed to clean up these sites is far from complete, which is why reauthorizing this program is critical. I'd like to thank the subcommittee for its attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Our next witness is Ms. Vernice Miller-Travis. She's the Vice Chair of the Maryland Commission on Environmental Justice and Sustainable Communities. She's a member of the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council to the U.S. EPA. Welcome, Ms. Travis.
Thank you, Chairman Gibbs and Ranking Member Napolitano and all the members of the committee for this hearing today. I have invested the last 22 years of my life in bringing this process forward in brownfields and helping to draft some of the language in the implementing law. I served on the All-Appropriate Inquiry Committee that wrote the implementing language for the Small Business Liability Relief and Brownfields Redevelopment Act. I was there at ground zero, as they say, when EPA began this process, and immediately I saw the opportunity to bring real long-term reinvestment to some of the most distressed parts of our community, of our country, which were also the places that had some of the biggest and largest and longest impacted brownfield sites across the country. So when EPA announced this process, I jumped at the chance to be a partner with them to really bring this process to life. One of the things that EPA did early on through its National Environmental Justice Advisory Council and the Subcommittee on Waste and Facility Siting, which I served as the co-chair of from 1997 to 2001, was to host a series of public dialogues on urban revitalization and brownfields, envisioning healthy and sustainable communities in 1995. The public dialogues were held in 5 cities: Boston, Philadelphia, Detroit, Oakland, California, and Atlanta, Georgia. The public dialogues were intended to provide an opportunity for environmental justice advocates and residents of environmentally impacted communities where brownfield sites proliferated to offer their input and perspective regarding the development of EPA's Brownfields Economic Redevelopment Initiative. In my written testimony, I included a link to the report. Here is my dog-eared copy that I still lecture from and talk about 19 years later because it's still very relevant. Those dialogues led to the publication of this report, and many concerns were raised by communities during that process, including whether or not the brownfields issue was a smokescreen for gutting cleanup standards, environmental regulations, and liability concerns. Because heretofore, when people talked about brownfields and recapturing industrial and commercial vacant spaces, they were talking about the real estate transactions, but not talking about the economic revitalization that could come to low-income and distressed communities who live near and bore the burden of the environmental contamination and the perceived disinvestment in their communities, which was driven largely dramatically by the loss of industrial and commercial activity in those communities. So this was a very personal issue for a lot of communities around the country who pinned their hopes on revitalization and new economic activity on the success of this program. So they have a tremendous amount invested in the Brownfields program. Much of the national conversation today regarding environmental protection and improving public health, job creation to address high levels of unemployment and underemployment, reducing growing inequality and poverty rates, and how to spur community revitalization and create public-private partnerships to undertake these decades-old problems were tackled in this report. The success of the program to date has been just extraordinary. We've heard lots today from Administrator Stanislaus and others, but by any objective measure, after 20 years of brownfields redevelopment, there's much to report in terms of success. For example, the Brownfields Job Training Program has trained over 14,100 individuals to become certified in a range of site remediation skills. The Brownfields Job Training Program graduates include many unemployed and underemployed veterans, at-risk young adults, and 50% of the graduates are ex-offenders. 70% of the Brownfields Job Training graduates have been placed in living wage jobs. The program's placement rate is to be highly commended, especially when one considers the target population of their trainees. Other successes of the program to date include hundreds of examples of transformative brownfields redevelopment projects, including the epic struggle to clean up brownfield sites and restore the Los Angeles River. Atlantic Station, where a former steel mill has been transferred into a brand new, thriving, high-end community in Atlanta, is really breathtaking if you haven't seen it. The Spigot River Revitalization Project, which is a partnership with Groundwork USA, where a once dying mill town has been revived in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and the Florida Brownfields Association partnership with Environmental Justice and other medically underserved communities like the East Side community of Jacksonville, Florida, by developing brownfield sites into healthcare facilities. But there's a downside to successful brownfields redevelopment. Of all the promise I envisioned for distressed urban communities via successful brownfields redevelopment, I did not envision the large-scale gentrification and displacement of long-standing communities of color that brownfields redevelopment projects have spawned in some places. For example, Bayview Hunters Point in San Francisco, the Dudley Street community in Roxbury, Massachusetts, here in the District of Columbia, the Southwest Waterfront, and my own beloved hometown of West Harlem in New York City, where Columbia University, my alma mater, is building a new campus that will occupy more square footage than the former World Trade Center. A lot of people in public housing and low-income and affordable housing are being displaced by a lot of these successful projects. That was not what EPA envisioned, but nevertheless, it is an unintended consequence. So we need to balance the economic revitalization that's happening and driven by brownfields redevelopment with the needs to make sure that that revitalization is broad-based. We must refocus our efforts if the hope of successful brownfields redevelopment is to bring broad-based economic opportunity and community revitalization to all. The last thing I would say is that the program needs to be fully funded. EPA's Brownfields Redevelopment Initiative has been catalytic in transforming economic opportunity in large cities, small cities, tribal communities, you name it. The Brownfields program has been there, and we want to see that revitalization happen everywhere, and your appropriation is what makes that program happen. I strongly recommend that you fully fund it, and please, under no circumstances, diminish the funding that goes to the Brownfields program. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, and that might be more talk to the appropriators. Ms. Hafner, I've seen your testimony. You cite about an example of a program in Louisville, Ohio, with the Chesapeake Energy. I want you to know that's in my district. I've been there. Great work. I just wanted to recognize that. I'm glad you put that in there. It's actually in my district. I do want to ask you, Ms. Hafner, in your testimony, you talk about how the state of Ohio handles liability aspects in its brownfield programs. Can you explain how the Ohio example could be replicated in the federal brownfields law?
In terms of the liability limitations?
Yeah. I'm really concerned about the liability aspects. What have you done in Ohio that maybe could be helpful in the federal legislation?
Well, notwithstanding, one of the most important things of the Brownfield program, in my view, is that the state's programs are uniquely designed for each and every state. So adopting some of the things that we did at Ohio and putting them on a federal level may not maintain that flexibility. However, individual liability tweaks along the way may provide some additional assistance to the volunteers and folks who are cleaning up the sites.
Ms. Race, do you have a comment on the liability aspects of your examples, where we should be looking at? Is there concerns?
Well, I would just add to that. I do agree that it is a state-by-state designation. There are several states. Pennsylvania is actually an example where an Act 3 has actually reduced some of the liabilities, and they've actually used wording to get their hands around that. I think with the liability protections, that's where the brownfields, the phase ones, and the due diligence is really important, because that actually gives you the AEI, all appropriate inquiry, gives you the baseline, some of those liability protections initially.
Okay. Mr. Gruber, I'm a little intrigued. We talked about the groundwater, cleaning up aquifers and stuff. Where it's feasible to do cleanup, what tools and technologies are available to ensure that the contamination doesn't spread? Can you just elaborate what's happening in that?
So there's a variety of different tools and technologies. Most effective and probably used most commonly are groundwater pump and treat systems. There are barriers that can be placed in ground that could prevent the spread of groundwater contamination, all associated with different levels of cost. So one of the roles that professionals like myself and Ms. Race get involved with is trying to optimize the groundwater treatment technology to stem the spread of contamination and to effectively treat the groundwater systems and prevent it from spreading.
I was really appreciative of your comments regarding the rural areas and green spaces and the need. We have, and you're right, you're absolutely right. There's lots of sites in rural areas like abandoned fertilizer facilities, whatever. And I think that's, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think there's an important need there. And then, of course, it really ties in the importance to the groundwater, because in the rural areas, that's where we get our water in most cases, and it's important. So.
That's correct. I think there's a real impact in rural areas associated with brownfield sites and the propensity for developers to look for new greenfield locations, particularly in areas, in rural areas where community water systems don't have a lot of funds available to treat groundwater. They're pumping it directly out of the ground with minimal treatment.
Yeah.
The effort to encourage redevelopment of brownfield sites as opposed to going to new greenfield locations is critically important to preserving community resources.
What's your experience with public-private partnerships, investments in brownfield sites?
Well, I think everybody's addressed the issues associated with liability limits. From a public investment perspective, obviously, liability limits are different than when private parties get involved. I would ask perhaps the mayor to address some of those issues, but the opportunity to increase private sector investment in public projects by limiting liability associated with the long-term development of these sites would go a long way towards accelerating the pace of brownfields redevelopment.
Mayor, it's a question, what recommendations would you have to improve the small business liability relief Brownfield Revitalization Act? I want to get back on the liability issue. What's your take on that, and what recommendations you might have to make that better to help incentivize people?
I believe it's in the testimony about removing the barriers to on the mothball sites and the circle of liability in the government of brownfield defined by Section 10139. If it did not cause or contribute to the contamination of the property, the exercise is due care with regard to any known contamination of the site. We also, in our testimony, have attached recommendations on exact language that we submitted in our written testimony, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Now, Ms. Napolitano?
Oh, definitely, sir. Thank you. In fact, I could do the whole 1 hour on this. Ms. Miller-Travis, your statement about investment in underserved communities, how would we incentivize the investors to be able to go to those areas? How, the market forces are great, and so they will go to where they think they're going to make the best investment. how would you incentivize them to go into lower income communities?
So there's been a lot of conversation about approaching the Department of the Treasury to explore opportunities to encourage greater use of new market tax credits and the low-income housing tax credits to enable those who are doing brownfields redevelopment to tap into those tax credit programs so that they could spur investment in terms of new markets as well as low-income
Is
housing.
that anywhere in writing? I'm sorry, but I want to run out of time.
Sure.
Because, you know, there's in reference to HUD, EDA, Department of Energy, DOT, Office of Economic Adjustments, Department of Defense, Community Health Initiative under CDC, all those areas add Treasury to it. Why are we not getting them all together and saying we need to address this as a whole rather than everybody doing their own thing and spreading those funds out in different areas?
It would be great if the new legislation or reauthorized legislation could direct EPA and the federal family to do exactly that. Because local governments, local community development organizations, state agencies are having to shop all of those entities.
But it would
They could all
take
be in
also
one.
those entities, the county and the cities, to be able to work with, including the governors' organizations. But
Yes.
now, how do we then look at prioritization of those areas, as Mr. Guru was saying, groundwater contamination, because we're having continuous drought cycles. That's not going to go away. How are we not looking at how do we protect groundwater? How do we clean it up? How do we help the communities be able to revitalize that source of
Yes.
critical water? Water is money. There's no investment if water isn't there for business.
Absolutely. So there's also a recommendation to encourage EPA to access its Clean Water State Revolving Fund, which allows states to then push money down, federal money down to local governments and tribal governments to really do new investment in infrastructure for clean water. We would like to see those that program, that revolving loan fund, be accessed and merged in a sense with access to the Brownfields revolving loan fund.
Would love to see your recommendations to this subcommittee, ma'am.
It's in my testimony, ma'am.
Right, I know, but that's a recommendation because I'm going to be looking a little further on this one. And to all of you, when was the last time that EPA utilized, how would I say, cost of living? Well, 2001 was when the maximum amounts were set. What do you think that affects the ability to be able to use those dollars in today's dollars? Anybody?
So, if I could start, I actually disagree a little bit with Administrator Stanislaus. I think the grant amounts do need to go up to $300,000, but that can only happen if the appropriation for the program is increased somewhat. But I do think it's time to increase the amount of money in those assessment grants.
Yeah, it was the
and those cleanup grants.
200,000 was set for 2001. Well, we're in 2014, 13 years later, and we're still at that amount.
Well, actually, 200,000 was set in 1995 when they first launched the program.
So you understand where I'm going is we need to increase the funding based on the today's dollars. Let's see, to Mr. Gruber, I very much am interested in how you look at the rural applicants because you have fertilizer and all kinds of other insecticides that go into the ground and eventually into the water table. How do we help be able to identify that, especially when there is no funding in those rural areas by small communities?
So I think EPA does have an outreach program and a technical assistance program to provide support to communities to develop brownfield grants. And I think we need to do as much as we can to encourage EPA to step up those activities, because often in rural communities, they may not have the technical resources or the financial resources to address the development of the grants, hire engineers like myself or Ms. Race. So I think anything you can do to increase opportunities for EPA to broaden their outreach to rural communities where many of these brownfield sites are located would be very instrumental in making the program more successful.
I was just going to add to that. I think one of the things that is being looked at now are technical assistance grants in a small amount of dollars, maybe in the $7,000 to $10,000 range, that those type of funds would be very instrumental to these small communities and these small entities that really can't afford to hire a big giant consultant or even actually facilitate something like
Yeah,
that.
understood. But don't forget, right now with economic stress that many of the communities face, they may not even be able to match any funding. So why are we not looking at the Treasury incentivizing those areas to be able to put those properties back on the tax roll?
I think it would be a great idea.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses. Although I came in late, I was reading your testimony while questions were being asked at another hearing that I was a part of. So I do appreciate what you're doing here today. And Mr. Gruber, I do want to put a specific emphasis on offering you my appreciation because the emphasis that you make in your testimony about the importance of Brownfields development in the projects in rural America that I know my colleague just alluded to. I want to commend you on that. And as you note, the impact of soil, surface, and groundwater contamination in rural areas can have serious implications for potable water supplies, and addressing these contaminations, you know, as I'm sure have been discussed before I got here, it can be very cost prohibitive to some of the smaller communities that I serve in Illinois, right in the middle of rural America. Earlier this year, I joined two of my colleagues from Illinois, John Shimkus and Mike Bost, in sending a letter of support to the EPA for a Brownfields assessment grant application submitted by Madison County, Illinois. I was subsequently pleased to learn that Madison County was actually awarded 2 Brownfields grants, one to assess a hazardous substance site and one to assess a site contaminated by petroleum. I look forward to working with Madison County, the other stakeholders, as these projects move forward. And I want to say thank you to those who made those decisions. Mr. Gruber, I know it was alluded to in the last question about how do we help ensure that rural America is not left behind when it comes to brownfield development projects. Are there any other, is there any advice that you would give us to be able to help make sure that does not happen?
Well, I think I addressed a little bit of it when I talked about EPA's ability to provide outreach and support to rural communities for the development of brownfield grants. I think Ms. Miller-Travis also addressed some critical funding issues. State grants under the Clean Water Act have been significantly diminished over the last 20 years. Anything Congress can do to increase appropriations and broaden the funding support under the Clean Water Act to support local communities, particularly in rural areas, which are often excluded from Clean Water Act funding grants, would be a very important mechanism to improve environmental quality and availability of surface and groundwater quality in rural areas.
Well, thank you, Mr. Gruber. I appreciate your comments. I too want to reprioritize how we spend money here in Washington, and that's something that I hope all my colleagues on both sides of the aisle want to continue to do. And that's the only way that Congress and our legislative branch can actually regain the power of the purse that many of the witnesses that sit at your tables that we see on a regular basis come in and talk about increased appropriations, the need for more money to actually put forth to solve some of the problems that we're even talking about here today. And I too agree. But both sides of the aisle also have to make some tough decisions on how we actually spend the taxpayer dollars. And that's a debate that I look forward to having with all of my colleagues here. I guess I'll open up my last question quickly to the first one who wants to volunteer to answer it. Is it your experience that the working relationship that state, local, and private leaders have with administrators of the Brownfields program at EPA has been positive? And is there any specific issue that you think could improve that communication or relationship? Who's first?
I'll go first.
Ms. Race.
I actually think that the state programs and the region programs are very strong as far as community outreach. I do a lot of work in Region 1 and Region 3. And I think there is a great partnership between those agencies. They do a great job in trying to get the word out there about what needs to be done. As far as more improvement, I think that sometimes the states need to talk more with the regions themselves as far as making sure that everybody is on the same page with what they want to have as the outcome.
Anybody else? I got 30 seconds.
I would just say that I think EPA has gone to great lengths to try and decentralize the Brownfields program, to put Brownfields coordinators in each of the regional offices to provide technical assistance, to provide counseling to states, to do make it possible to do the letters of no further action so the states can give people a sense of comfort that they can go in and redevelop those sites and purchase them without getting tangled up into the circular liability scheme. I think EPA has spent 20 years trying to figure out how to push this money out and down and give as much technical assistance as they can. And if you are in Chicago, since you're from Illinois, if you can be there the first week of September for the Brownfields Conference, you will see thousands of people from all over the country who have been able to do extraordinary work because of the support of EPA.
Well, let me see if that might be a possibility. I'm 3.5 hours south, hence the rural America references. But I do very much appreciate the largest city in my state of Illinois, and I would love to be able to be a part of that. Thank you. My time's expired.
Ms. Johnson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me thank you and the ranking member for holding this hearing, and let me thank all the witnesses. I have enjoyed hearing all of you, and I think it's because I agree with everything you've said. It is gratifying to see that EPA has a program that gets so much positiveness. EPA is probably one of the most beat-up agencies around here when they're trying to protect the health of individuals. But I have strongly supported the Brownfield legislation over the years, and feel that because it is such a public-private partnership, it has been very, very successful. And I would hope that all of you would advocate, because I think that there are more and more municipalities and small municipalities as well that will need to put brownfields into greenfields to create more of a tax base. When you create that tax base, we all profit from it because some of those tax flow back in here where we need some money. So I would applaud you for working with the program. I don't have any particular questions other than what I would ask you probably might be illegal for you to answer, and that is, how much do you advocate reauthorizing this program with more dollars? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I won't insist that they answer that.
Thank you. I have just a couple of questions for the panel I'd like to ask. Are there any categories of parties like tenants or other non-owner parties that might occupy or use a site who still fear exposure to the Superfund liability, even though they did not contribute to the contamination of the brownfield sites? Does anybody want to respond? Is there still a fear out there?
I'll take a crack at that. One of the issues I think that we've been advocating as an organization and an association is associated with vapor monitoring and vapor intrusion in occupied buildings, particularly at sites that are on or near petroleum locations, because the volatile organic chemicals from petroleum spills can easily seep into buildings. Oh, yeah. So people may not know that they could be exposed to harmful vapors from toxic gases. So I think the funding and the effort associated with vapor monitoring and vapor intrusion could be improved as part of the program to protect residents in buildings.
Yes, Mayor.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, what we did with the Jersey Gardens Mall, which was built on a landfill, is we vented the methane and then created power from the methane for the mall. So the 200 and some odd stores that are in the Jersey Gardens, plus all the people that go there, we don't really deal with the issue because of the proper ventilation.
Ms. Race.
And I think I would just add, there are sites that I think some of the federal programs have to talk to each other. Some of the RCRA obligations are not the same as some of the brownfields. And what I mean by that is there are entities out there that are interested in using brownfields monies to redevelop a property, but because it has a RCRA designation, there's certain liability protections that they just can't get over because of the RCRA Superfund tie-ins with that.
Okay, Ms. Race, you mentioned in your testimony about the 25% set aside, and I mentioned it on the petroleum. I mentioned that to the administrator, and you heard his response. What's your take on how we should modify that, or?
I'm thrilled. I think there should be actually either do away with it or have a much less percentage that has to go to petroleum. I can speak as one that has a lot of grantees that has a lot of money sitting on the sidelines that they just cannot use for petroleum.
What would your take be on the applications? I think everybody's in agreement we're making progress with this petroleum abandoned tanks. What percent would you guess might be in the application process now that actually would qualify for that set aside?
I think I'd rather see closer to 10%, not any more than 10%. It's just because of state designation and a case by case where the state actually makes that determination. A lot of states are requiring tax returns for a property owner before they can actually even assume that there's any viability for financial.
I know you mentioned flexibility, and
yes.
and I'm big for that too. And I think that obviously when that was put in, it probably made a lot of sense because like I said, there was a gas station on 3 of the 4 corners, and typically in most in urban areas. So,
if I might add to that,
yes.
Many states have leaking underground storage tank program funding mechanisms individually. So the opportunity to investigate and clean up underground storage tanks can come from other sources and not the Brownfields program. So it's a way of leveraging other dollars and improving and increasing opportunities if you remove the 25% requirement for funding for underground storage tanks under the Brownfield program.
Excellent point. Do you have any more questions or not?
No questions, but I certainly would want to ask all the panelists to forward any recommendations you might have that'll help this subcommittee be able to understand some of the things that you're facing that we may not have in writing, especially issues like coordination between the agencies to be able to leverage. And then how do we reach out to the Conference of Mayors, the League of Cities, the Governors Associations, to have them identify where their major issues are in economic development, to be able to help us understand a little better how EPA can then look at, maybe it's rural, to me it's groundwater aquifer contamination because of the drought issue, things that you see might help us be able to better deal with this issue as a subcommittee, a joint subcommittee, and on a bipartisan basis, because water and economic development is everybody's issue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I do have one more question, since we do have a state administrator here with a very successful program. Ms. Hafner, if you could name what the most important aspect of your Brownfield program success, what would it be?
I think that at least in Ohio, and other folks have talked about it, so it's probably true in other states as well, but it's our collaboration with the stakeholders who are actually implementing the program. So the local governments, the consultants, the developers, we are truly partners with them in not only developing the statute and writing the rules, but also in implementing the program. It is a culture of working together collaboratively, and so even the staff view this as it's part of their job to ask those folks first, what do you need to make this program better? And so I think it's a little bit unique at Ohio EPA, and that to me is one of the most important factors to its success.
Just a thought too, I'm just curious, is there times when you have to work with, besides the U.S. EPA, but I mean another federal agency, could be the Army Corps of Engineers, is there, transportation, Department of Transportation, can you elaborate if that's the case or not?
Right. Well, most of our partners are U.S. EPA and the local governments, but the Navy was interested in using the voluntary program to clean up a site in Ohio. And so far, we've not gotten the Army Corps of Engineers to use some of the old defense sites in the voluntary program, but that would be of interest to us. So.
Okay. Well, thank you for all witnesses coming today, and it's been very helpful to us in the written testimony. So, as we look towards working for reauthorization of the Brownfields Revitalization Program. So, thank you, and that adjourns this hearing.